Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Michelle Derosier, a filmmaker here in Northwestern Ontario. Welcome back, Michelle.
Thank you, Steve.
In the last segment, we were talking a little bit about the newest production you've got, the Grandfather Drum. And what I heard you talking about in part was our local history, where a lot of the cultural practices of the First Nations people were discouraged, prohibited, outlawed. And the little history I know, or I think I know, because I'm not sure how much we really know about our history, is that this actually happened with the drum as well. That the traditional use of the drum was discouraged, and in this case, that drum was somehow separated from that tradition.
A lot of our cultural practices were actually outlawed, right? I mean, so up until 1951, which is very, very recent. And, you know, that has had devastating effects, as we see, you know, with a lot of the social ills. I think that, you know, the sort of powers that be, the Canadian state and the government and the churches, sort of were very strategic in that, and even went with first contact, you know, that I think what had happened was that they had seen a very, very powerful people with very powerful elements, like the drum, like the ceremonies, like the medicines, like the language, you know, and the education that we passed on, our own system of education, right, prior to Western. But you know, if we sit and we think about what's happening now in the country, you know, and it's being revealed that all of these things that I speak about were the things that were attacked, right? I mean, the language, the education, the system, the culture, you know, these things kept us thriving and kept us strong as a people and as communities and families for thousands of years.
Yes.
And in a very short period of time, you know, that was, you know, the attempt, you know, some people will use the word genocide, you know, when speaking of this history in our country. And, you know, it's, we've suffered a lot of loss and a lot of damage in our families and in our communities. You know, these things don't just happen. You know, we haven't just arrived in this place where, you know, we struggle with high incarceration rates, you know, or we struggle with substandard, below substandard housing in our First Nation communities, you know, or that our young people, you know, hold the highest suicide rate in the country, you know, as Indigenous children. These things don't just happen, you know, and I think that as a country, people are starting to listen. And people are starting to wake up to the fact that, you know, it's not just because, you know, they're weaker, you know, or that there's something wrong with a particular group of people, being the Indigenous people of the country, but that those things were in place and imposed by law very strategically.
And I've just read a couple of Tom King's books recently. And you know, and he really makes a strong point. It's about land.
It is.
It's about people taking land from other people. And as part of that, painting, you know, we're the newcomers and we're smarter and we're better, and you guys aren't so smart. So it feels like it's the foundation of racism, of saying I'm better than you, so I deserve this where you don't, or something. And so we've got all this history kind of that came before us, but we've got it now. We, you know, the laws were created, we followed those cultural changes, but now we're trying to pick up the pieces. And what I see is that in your art, in your film, you're trying to deal with some of these issues. Am I on the right track there?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, everything that I do, I think, is but I know that it's connected to somehow, you know, trying to do my part, right? And it's a social responsibility. And although, I mean, I'm just sort of one person and we all, I mean, but so what's exciting right now is starting to see a lot of other people, and not just the artists, because, you know, oftentimes artists tend to lead, you know, and that's what we've been seeing in the country, you know, around things like murdered and missing Indigenous women, you know, and having Métis artists like Christy Belcourt, you know, and, you know, doing the Walking with Our Sisters, and, you know, other crazy and powerful and beautiful, but also so socially, like, with the intent of awakening, you know, ourselves and other people to pay attention to these things that have been happening for a very long time are very, very exciting. But it's also not without great loss, you know, and there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of work to be done in our communities, you know, because when we think about, you know, this history, right? I mean, it's very, some of it was very insidious, and some of it is it's very pervasive, and has really gotten into, I think, the core of Canadian society and generations of our thinking, you know, of Indigenous people, as myself, as, you know, I have found myself in situations where, you know, you can feel dehumanized as a person, you know, and that's directly connected to that history and that learning, you know, that oftentimes people don't even really realize where that came from, you know, because it's so embedded in the Canadian state and what we've taught our children and through generations, you know, about Indians, you know, back then, to use a term, right?
Yeah.
So there's but there's a lot of shifts, and there's a lot of really amazing things that are happening, you know, in our country and in our community, that are propelling us into a different direction, which I think is, you know, it's beyond needed. So.
And you know, it's funny. As a kid, you know, we'd play cowboys and Indians, and I was happy to play either one. And you know, and I developed this idea of Indians that I liked. You know, that were in harmony with the planet and close to nature, and community was a big part. But I don't really know. I don't really know the history. I was never really taught the history of First Nations. So now I'm just struggling to try to say, okay, were those assumptions even right? I don't know. Am I doing the wrong thing? Am I attributing, you know, whatever. We're just planning a little giveaway later this week, my wife and I, you know, of family goods, and kind of going, well, that's kind of a cool tradition. I wonder, you know, like, are we doing it the right way or anything? But in a way, I'm just kind of going, gee, the more we know about the cultures around us and the history, there's a lot to be gained. And First Nations people who've lived here for thousands of years figured something out, you know, before we got climate change and polluting our planet and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking too much.
No.
But anyways, I've talked us into another break, so please stay tuned. We'll be right back.